A very good morning to you, everyone. Welcome to this Fundi and Mail and Guardian webinar on navigating the student loan landscape. My name is Thembekile Mrototo, and I'm going to be your moderator for this morning. We're going to be together from around now until about 12:30. As ever, we encourage as much participation from you as possible. We put together a fantastic team of panelists who will be able to speak, in fact, from an expert level, if you will, about the issue of funding, especially within the university or higher education space. We're going to have shortly opening or welcoming remarks, and then we'll also have a keynote address for you this morning, and then later a question and answer session just after the keynote address, where we will encourage you to pop your questions into the mailbox, and then I will then read them out and hopefully be able to get our speaker this morning to respond to those. And once we are going, please feel free to participate as much as possible, because ultimately this session is about all of you, especially as the student community taking part in these conversations about something that affects you on the daily. And without any further waste of time, then let's get straight to the opening as well as welcome remarks this morning, and welcome to the platform, Mpho Singo. Mpho, are you there? Let's just give Mpho a moment. Mpho Singo, by the way, is the External Communications Manager with African Bank. They've helped make this possible for us to be here this morning to talk once more about a very important topic, navigating the student loan landscape. We're speaking at a very important time. We're halfway through the year, because soon the next cohort, if you will, of those who are in matric this year will have to start exploring their funding options if they've not already. If you're already in the higher education system, you too may be looking to perhaps secure funding for 2024, because some funding would have come to an end perhaps this year, and now you have to look at other alternatives. And who better to speak to this morning than the panelists, excuse me, whom we've put together for you today. And thanks once more to Fundi and Mail Guardian for making it possible. I think Mpho is having connectivity issues, a good friend load shedding to blame. So let's move on then. And I'm going to now introduce our keynote speaker, who is just as important this morning. I'm talking about Mikateko Chauke. Now, she boasts over 19 years' experience in communications, reputation management, stakeholder relations, marketing, and advertising. She's worked for various organizations, including Sasol, FCB Johannesburg, Ogilvy PR, and has played a huge role in developing a turnaround brand strategies for clients, including APSA, Capitec, Shell, McDonald's, and Sianda Resources, as well as the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, to mention but a few. Ms. Chauke also holds an MBA from Henley Business School, a degree in PR, that's from the Val University of Technology, and a certificate in design from Vega. Her list of accomplishments continues. She also completed the Management Advancement Program with Wits Business School, and currently, and this is why she's here to speak to us today, she is currently the head of strategic comms and PR for African Bank. So let's all welcome then to the platform, Ms. Mikateko Chauke. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Thembekile. What a lovely introduction you just gave me there. Good morning, everyone, and to all the participants. Indeed, it does give me a great pleasure to contribute to this critical discussion that underscores the pressing concern faced by our younger generation today. Mastering financial literacy, prudence within which is prudent within the student loan landscape. This is particularly relevant in light of recent events that once again spotlighted students' financial hurdles, including the notable student protests at the dawn of this year. Now, considering the aforementioned difficulties faced by students, the necessity for younger generations to foster discipline, consistency, and a clear awareness of their limitations becomes paramount. This holds especially true when managing allocated funding by funding institutions. With that said, students' limited knowledge and financial awareness often result in overspending. When compounded with delayed payments, financial exclusion, and the reality known as the missing middle, the magnitude of the challenges students face today confronts concerning student debt, repayments, and loans. It becomes very clear. These issues, however, only represent a portion of the contributing factors. In order to get a better understanding of the factors that contribute to students' financial burdens, it is quite important to first get a comprehensive overview of the student landscape loan in South Africa. Now, in light of the South African student landscape loan in South Africa, students are presented with a couple of avenues for acquiring funding. These include government-funded organizations, private entities, and independent institutions. Primarily, student loans, the landscape in South Africa is dominated by government-funded bodies such as the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NFSAS, which I think contributes more or less about 47 billion that has been allocated to funding approximately about 900,000 students as beneficiaries. And I think this is, contributing towards this academic year in particular. Now, alongside NFSS, we've got private financial institutions that offer also student loans, bursaries, and scholarships as well. These loans are generally based on the applicant's credit worthiness and may feature higher interest rates compared to the NFSS loans. For students who don't qualify for NFSS or need additional funding beyond what NFSS provides, private student loans could serve as a viable alternative. And even so, NFSS is the primary provider of student loans in South Africa. It offers loans and bursaries for students that are in need of financial assistance to cover their tuition fees, accommodation, textbooks, and other study-related expenses. The loans provided by NFSS are generally interest-free, and repayment is income contingent based on the graduate's income. Commercial banks and other financial institutions, on the other hand, may also offer student loans as well as either part of their product offering or through specific education loan programs. These loans typically require some sort of collateral or a co-signer and may have higher interest rates compared to government-funded loans. Indeed, the existence of these governmental and private loan entities, it is quite pivotal for students to finance their education and subsequently their future. However, understanding the origin of these bodies demands an appreciation of all the costs associated with studying in South Africa. It's also quite important for us to know that costs can vary depending on the specific university, location, program of study, and personal lifestyle choices. General costs that students need to be aware of include tuition fees, accommodation, textbooks, and other relevant study material. Now, tuition fees in South Africa differ depending on the institution and the program of study which one chooses to embark on. Public universities generally have lower tuition fees for citizens. On the other hand, private universities do offer a little bit of a higher tuition fees overall. On average, tuition fees for average programs in South Africa and within the learning institutions can range anywhere from about let's say 50,000 rands to even as much as 120, 150,000 rands per year for South African students. Housing expenses are influenced by factors such as whether you live on campus or off campus, as well as the university's geographical location. Beyond this, students must also account for textbooks and study materials. Nevertheless, these expenses represent an initial financial commitment. There's a broad spectrum of costs students need to consider, encompassing factors or aspects such as transportation, sustenance, lifestyle expenses, healthcare costs, and other personal expenses. So this morning, as we proceed to delve into the student finance planning, it is quite crucial, which I might stress, to keep in mind that the ability to plan financially is not merely instrumental in accomplishing academic objectives, but it also empowers students to manage their budgets, reduce debt, nurture sound financial habits, establish an emergency fund, invest in their future, and achieve financial autonomy. In closing, I'd like to underscore that while student loans are a powerful tool in helping students realize their aspirations in their university careers, they also come with responsibility. So I would urge everyone that before committing to any sort of financial assistance, students must thoroughly research their options, especially the type of assistance or loan they intend to acquire, as each type, whether government, private, or independent, is closely tied to the student's lifestyle. Student loans have a profound impact on students' financial future. Therefore, the most effective repayment strategy is one that doesn't burden an individual with a lifetime of debt. It is also important to have an open conversation with the financier to understand the agreement you are entering into. Arguably, the most significant point is that students owe it to themselves to acquire the necessary knowledge to manage their finances and budget their allowances responsibly. The question of who should impart this knowledge remains a matter of an ongoing debate. As the timeless saying goes, preparation is the cornerstone of success. By beginning and planning their journey properly now, students can enjoy the fruits of their diligence throughout their educational journey and beyond. Thank you, Thembekile.
Migateko, thank you very much for that, Miss Migateko Chauke. You know, as you're talking about sending responsibly, I felt a little slight there. Perhaps the message has come a bit too late for some of us, but thank you very much for that. Migateko is the head of strategic comms and PR at African Bank, Miss Migateko Chauke. Now, earlier, we had a bit of a technical wobble. We were supposed to hear from the external communications manager, also from African Bank, Mpho Singo, who I am pleased to report is now actually able to join us. And Mpho, if you can hear me, take it away. We can't hear you now. Let's see if we can sort out Mpho's audio there. And while we wait for Mpho to then be able to speak to us, we're going to take her off mute and see if we can get that going. But just on what we're hearing from Ms. Migateko Chauke a short time ago, just in terms of where we are in terms of student funding in South Africa, we know there are still basically three, if you will, blocks of people: those who can afford higher education, those who are called the missing middle, deemed perhaps too, or families that are deemed to have too much of an income to get NSFAS funding, but also will often be told by some banks that their families make too little to be able to meet the financial obligations that would come with those sort of loans that they need. Migadego was telling us, for example, a short time ago that on average in this country, tuition alone costs between 50 to 150,000 rand. That's for 1 year, excluding accommodation and everything. That gives you an idea, doesn't it, of how expensive education still is at a higher education level in South Africa. Mpho, I believe that you're able to speak to us now. Mpho Singo, External Communications Manager at African Bank.
Thank you so much, Thembekile. Of course, it's never without any technical gremlins that whenever you're doing anything online. But thank you so much. You know, a very warm welcome to everyone that has joined us this morning. I think Mika has already painted how much of an insightful conversation it's going to be, an engaging session, and we really encourage people to engage us on the comments and the likes. And as Thembekile has said, my name is Mpho Singo, and I'm the External Communications Manager for African Bank. It is such an honor for me personally, as well as from a brand perspective, to be on this platform this morning, and really to have gone into this partnership with the Fundi Connect team and everyone else that has really helped in getting us to where we are. I think, like I said, Mika has really painted a very clear picture of why we're here. We need to really delve deep into a very important conversation around education as well as financing by really honing in on these strategies that go really into making one's education a successful one. I think I speak on everyone's behalf, particularly from the partners, the speakers, to say it's really going to be an insightful one, and that we're going to unpack. Oh my God. Not sure if everyone can still hear me.
We are still able to hear you, Mpho. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, seems to be dropping on my end. But really, just to close it off, I'd continue to encourage people to engage with us and really take away from this insightful information that they can apply as we continue to journey on your education and financial journey, to enhance us. So yeah, I encourage everyone to listen attentively, engage, and please share those burning questions in the comment section. Thank you so much, and here's to a productive webinar without a doubt. Thank you so much, Thembekile.
Thank you very much, and Paul. We powered through despite those technical difficulties there. And I'm already seeing some of the comments from you, Tandanani, who says, beautiful speech, very informative, says Miss Anelani. Kolani Dube, I see you as well. You said interesting conversation. Let's also keep the questions coming. I saw one earlier about funding, for example, for people who are studying in this country but are not South African. Ben George will try to answer that for you later during our conversations today. So if you can keep those questions coming, I will then put them to our panelists as and when we have made it through the panel that we're going to talk to now, in fact, about the issue of navigating the student loan landscape in South Africa. I mean, before Mpo came on, we are talking about how complex it is to get funding in South Africa, right? You can get NSFAS funding, which would be funding via the government, but that comes with a cap as well. So if then NSFAS says you, as a family, make too much money per annum and therefore don't qualify, and the banks say, well, you perhaps make too little to commit to the sort of financial backing that you would need. There's the issue of the missing middle, and that's what the country, be it private institutions or indeed the government, have been grappling with now, what to do with the people who are in the middle, and possibly the majority of people in South Africa who, yes, there's money coming in, but you simply cannot afford too big a financial obligation, but you do want to study. And speaking of that, I'm going to bring in our panelists now, people at the coalface, if you will, in terms of what happens on South African tertiary education grounds. And one of them is uh, Peter Mbati, the Vice Chancellor at the Sefako Makgato Health Sciences University. Let me just tell you more about the VC, because he has extensive experience in the higher education space, for example, at executive leadership level, especially because he served as VC of the University of Venda, Group Executive for Livestock at the Agricultural Research Council. A very good morning to you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, Thembekile, and good morning to
Thank
our viewers.
Right, thank you, Prof. I'm also going to bring in Ms. Merima Bonya, an energetic and results-driven executive head of Fundi's lending division, with over 18 years of experience in the financial and educational industry. She is accomplished and highly effective and offers diversified industry exposure as well as expertise in driving and leading the differentiated operations of the organization. So Ms. Merima Bonya joining us also today from Fundi, the lending division there. And then lastly, a student voice among us to tell us what exactly is going on. We're joined by the University of Johannesburg's SRC president. I'm talking about Mxolisi Manana. He has been described as a dedicated and accomplished student leader. He is, as I was saying, currently the leader of the SRC at the University of Johannesburg, and has a strong commitment to student welfare as well as representation, and has already made a significant impact on campus politics throughout his tenure and the importance of changing things. And in fact, Mxolisi, perhaps you're the best person to start with as a student to give us an idea of how complicated the funding situation is for students.
Good morning to Megile and to everyone else that is viewing online. And thank you so much for having us. Look, the challenges, we learn about them, of course, on a daily basis on media, insofar as higher education funding is concerned, because this is not only limited to the universities, but also in TVET sector. But I will, of course, stick to universities as it relates to this current conversation. But I think the first speaker would have highlighted the three spheres of students who are seeking funding, students who are on bursaries, students whom are referred to as the missing middle, and students whom are funded by government funding, which is the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. But of course, this is a very complex conversation. This is a very complex situation in higher education, because all of these students who rely on government funding, or even funding that is available and made available to students by the universities themselves, they have a what you call a a way to obtain this funding through Fundi. which offers loans through other financial institutions that offer these loans. But in the main, of course, we see these protests because at the end of the year, when students leave for home, you find that there is no way or there is no direct indication to them to inform them of the funding possibilities and the certainty of them to be funded the following year, and hence why you see the registration backlogs and the registration challenges that would experience from time to time. So, of course, the challenges are complex, and they range from the different spheres of students who are funded. Thanks.
And just on that, then, Mxolisi, we talk about how complex it is. Do you find that the environment has become, shall we say, more responsive, more agile to the needs of the student population at a funding level?
Yes, of course. Look, I think over time we would have seen many partners contributing towards this crisis in South Africa. We've seen the private sector coming on board. We've seen government itself. I think also we would need to recognize the efforts that have been made by government, where from previous years the treasury would allocate a certain budget for funding in higher education, but then in between the financial year, then by of course the request of the minister, you'd find that whatever kept amount that has been given to higher education would then be topped up just to assist the gap and the number of students that still do not have funding. So there is interventions that have been made by both private sector and public sector, and of course we should recognize the efforts that have been made by those two sectors. So and of course even in universities, there's hardship funds, there's trust funds in universities that also contribute towards this. But of course, the reality is that it is not yet uhuru, as we refer to it. So there are still challenges in the system, of course, but so much has been done, and we see this in the efforts of government and in the efforts of the private sector collaborating with government, ensuring that our students in the higher education sector are catered for.
And Professor Mbati, that is the student perspective. As VC and someone who's been in the higher education space for the many years which you have been, how would you characterize the complexity, as Mxolisi was saying, of student funding today, and perhaps how it's evolved over the years, if it's evolved at all?
Yeah, Thembekile, thank you very much. Indeed, first I must say that as the UJSRC president has indicated, there's been a lot of commitment from government to make funding available. In fact, a substantial portion of the budget from our own Department for Higher Education and Training does go towards tuition for students, accommodation, and so on. Thembekile, the fact is that the numbers are also growing in our higher education sector, both in universities and TVETs, and therefore the demand continues to grow. You already referred to the missing middle, and that is a portion that usually would require funding, is not able to get funding for various reasons. But you may have also individuals that are outside the missing middle who, on paper, should be able to afford tuition. But the fact is that parents may struggle, especially if they have a number of dependents. So it is a very complex ecosystem, and certainly you want all hands on deck to ensure that funding is made available. Certainly you have institutions like Fundi coming on board, and Fundi, I know, has been really assisting for many, many years as one of their commitments. We have a number of financial institutions coming on board, providing loans, as we were told in the keynote address earlier on. But I think that the big issue for me is the sustainability of all the methods that we have. And I think it's a conversation that we continue to have in the sector. We have to find a way in which this becomes sustainable in the long run. We have to find ways in which those who have been supported, particularly by NSFAS as an example, find ways to give back so that the pot of money, as it is continuously refilled to be able to assist future generations. Now, I must also indicate, Thembekile, that one of the challenges that I have also seen over time is students who finish a first degree and want to do a second undergraduate degree. Now, NSFAS does not fund those kind of students. So an example at Sefako Mahato Health Sciences University, you may have a student who has gone through a program in the School of Science and Technology and later wants to go and do a degree in medicine or pharmacy or in the dental program. Now, NSFAS normally would not fund those kind of students, but it is a skill that we need to develop for the country. And those are issues, again, that we discuss with the NSFAS. Certainly, you have other funding organizations that come on board that provide loans that students could take. But that is, again, one of the challenges that you have in the sector. Students who have completed a first degree and want to go for a second degree. So there is a lot of effort, but it's a very complex space, as you've indicated. And I think continuously we keep on engaging on methods that particularly make funding more available, but make it sustainable in the long run. Thank you very much.
I wonder how much has changed, because when I was at university about a good 10 years ago, without giving away my age, we were always told, even in high school, in fact, that it was easier to get a bursary, to get funding if, for example, the degree you wanted to pursue spoke to an area where there was a critical skills shortage or something that was deemed as more important, i.e. medicine, engineering, perhaps even education. Is that still the reality?
Yes, yeah. I think for what we call the scarce skills degree programs, you are bound to be helped a little faster. So yes, there is still prioritization for the scarce skills programs in universities, and I must say, various funders also tend to put more of their funding towards the scarce skills programs.
And in terms of the institution itself, Sefako Mahato University, how much are you able to do? Because universities have also faced pressure directly, especially in the last 10 years or so, to also intervene, whereas in the past, it's something that would have been left to the likes of NSFAS and private financial institutions to basically ensure that students are able to come and study. What are you able to do?
Well, so typically we do a number of things, and I'm sure this happens across many of our universities in the sector. One is we do provide scholarships for the very high-performing students. In fact, we've set it at about, well, really your top cream, 1%. So we do provide those kind of scholarships. What we've also done is that we have a committee that would look at a case-by-case basis for a student who may not be able to afford to pay tuition, and see the kind of intervention we can make. One would be to probably provide a little more time for the guardians of the students to get funding, or, which I actively do as a vice chancellor, and many vice chancellors do the same, is to look for other potential sponsors that provide funding for students. We have a number of third stream income projects that we do. So I'll give you an example. We have annual dinners that we have to raise funds for students. You have a golf day. We have something we call a Harambe Day, where even staff, from the vice chancellor to members of staff, make contributions, which then ultimately will translate to a bursary to a student. Or the other thing, Thembekile, which is a reality in our higher education sector, is beyond providing tuition and accommodation, you have students that struggle to get meals. And so we also provide funds through a program that we call Hands of Compassion, so that a student can go to class when they have had a meal, and sometimes toiletries and things like that. So it's sometimes it's not just the tuition and accommodation, it's actually sometimes just the basics that students require to go through in the university. So we have a lot of interventions that we make as a university. And I mean, I can tell you one of our tasks as vice chancellors is continuously engaging with, like I said, private sector, some of our state-owned enterprises, sometimes even going to certain government departments and saying, do you have some funding that we could make available to our students? Because it is in our best interest, by the way, as universities, to make sure that the students finish their programs on time and leave the institution. It is in our interest also as institutions so that new enrollments and new students can get into the system.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Professor Mbati, for speaking to us about that issue. We'll come back to you in a moment. And to you who are on the virtual platform, I do see your questions. We're going to get the panel to respond in a moment. Ben George, I see you. Lorato Mapanga, I see you as well. Ngobile Kado, I also see your question. I want to bring in our third panelist for the moment, Mary Maponya, Executive Head of Lending at Fundi. Mary, if you're there, we've heard from the SRC at UJ. We've heard from Professor Mbati at Sefako Makgato. As Fundi, how are you responding to the challenges in the higher education funding space? Is Mary with us? Oh, there she is.
Good morning, Thembekile. Thank you for having me. Here at Fundi, we believe that it is key to unlock one's dreams. So, and in that effort to support and enable the South African education dreams, here at Fundi, we can offer the student loans and that are able to cover the missing middle gap. So we constantly engage with universities and private colleges to solution for their problems of their students not being able to have funding to cover their student fees. So at Fundi, we are also looking at launching few new products in the near future, whereby the products will enable us to issue loans that are more affordable to the students. Thembekile. Thank you.
And just on that, Mary, you mentioned the fact that you guys have new products coming online soon. Fundi has been around for a couple of years now. Do you find that you are constantly having to evolve in order to respond to the needs of the market, so to speak?
Yes, Thembekile. We are always looking at new ways of solutioning for the institutions and also their challenges, what they are currently facing. So yes, we are evolving around helping the students and also making sure that the universities and private institutions meet their expectations, and we work together to solution for these current situations that we as South Africans we are facing.
And I've got a question for you, Mary, as we open up to everyone who's listening, our audience. Graham Moore wants to know from you Fundi's view on minimum qualification criteria, which many students, he says, who do not get NSFAS support would struggle to meet. What is your criteria, and perhaps how does it differ from the NSFAS model?
Our criteria, you have to be permanently employed for us to for you to qualify for a student funding, work for a government sector or few private companies that we have a salary agreement with. You must be 18 years and older. You must not be under administration. You must be permanently working. So we have our call center in our branches that can assist you. The administrative requirements are as follows. You must complete our Fundi fully application form, certified ID copy, salary advice, and a quotation or a statement from the institution that you intend to study. And also, we cover the outstanding balances. Some of the financial institutions, they don't cover outstanding balances. Here at Fundi, we cover the outstanding balances. If you are a student or an applicant, if you have registered and you are unable to pay for your outstanding balances, here at Fundi, we can assist you.
Mm-hmm. And do you also do post-grad funding? Because there's someone here who says, Lerato says, she's been to the Department of Education for funding for an honors degree in psychology, but still cannot get funding. How can she go about that?
Yes, we do cover the postgrad qualifications, we cover the certificates, we cover the undergrad qualifications.
Mhm. And I want
We
to come to the,
also, yes, we
please.
also cover the MBAs.
Fantastic. And do you then assist people who are not South African citizens?
Yes, as long as they are studying here in South Africa and their sponsor are working here in South Africa.
Oh, fantastic. I want to thank you very much for that, Mary. Come back to the panel and talk about the issue of accommodation because it's coming up quite a lot in the questions. And Golisi, let me come back to you as an SRC leader. I've seen in my work in newsrooms over the past 10 years or so, a lot of complaints at the beginning of the year come from students who say, well, my parents have been able to scrape together money for me to study for the year, or my bursary only studies or covers tuition. I have no place to stay. How big is the need for a place to stay in higher education?
Thanks, Tim, for that question. Look, of course, the accommodation challenge is a big challenge in the higher education sector as it relates to students. And of course, often at times we battle for the number of beds that are offered by the universities themselves, and of course, private accommodation service providers. But I think times have changed now. We no longer have a big of a crisis, especially in your inland universities, as opposed to the coastal provinces as opposed to the universities in the coastal provinces. But of course, I would also want to speak to what you mentioned, that some bursaries, and I can say this from the government perspectives, we have the Gauteng City Region Academy that offers bursaries, and it's from the MEC of Education in Gauteng, or the Premier rather. So that they also offer what you call I think it's funding that relates only to tuition and not maybe the full bursary. So it would be funding that would cover your tuition only, or it would be funding that would cover your accommodation expenses. So you find that from time to time, students come and say, no, look, I have funding for my tuition. There is a part-time job that I'm working at a restaurant or wherever, and I can be able to pay for my tuition fees. But I don't have the funding to pay for accommodation, or I don't have funding for my meals at the university. So we are starting to see not only private sector playing a role, but government, as I've indicated, insofar as funding, giving a portion of whatever funds that you require to students whom I need. So we are seeing that happen. And of course, there is a big role played by private sector as well, insofar as saying that if I maybe a high-rise building that has 1,000 beds, they say that 10 of our beds will be given to students who don't have accommodation. So we're seeing private sector as well playing a leading role as it relates to that. And those are some of the initiatives that are being played by the private sector. But from an SRC perspective, our discussion is that as an SRC, we ought to also speak to universities to put pressure on the private sector to say these people who are offering beds to students, they must, I mean, if at least at minimum you provide 500 beds to students or to a university, at least a significant portion of that should go to students who don't have accommodation, because many of our students now are coming saying that I've got funding for my tuition, but I don't have funding for accommodation. So how best can the SRC or the university or private sector assist me with that regard? And we're seeing those initiatives come into play as well. So there
And
is
what
a
more do
right.
you think? Apologies, Mgodisi, what more do you think can be done to help those others who are today still struggling?
Look, I think there are initiatives that are done. I would have learned of one from Joshko, which is an entity in the city of Johannesburg, where they are not now building only low cost housing, but they are also moving into the student accommodation challenges that we have, and they're building now buildings that are suitable for students at a very low price. So this will then indicate and mean that a significant number of our students who rely on private accommodation or who are staying in accommodation that is expensive can now have the option of using this accommodation that comes at a cheaper rate. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing it happen in other universities as well. So there is so much that has been done, and we do, of course, recognize the efforts that has been done by private sector.
Professor Mbati, let's talk about the accommodation issue from a vice chancellor standpoint, because universities don't have unlimited space as far as campus residences. Students are complaining at the moment that if you live off campus, it's either too expensive, or if you get one that's affordable, there's an issue of living in an unsafe space. Do you have any thoughts on how perhaps the two worlds can find each other?
Yeah, Thembekile, it's always a very difficult question, and as you know, nowadays we take accommodation to be an extension of a learning space. So it's not like during your time, Thembekile, where you just went to a residence and relaxed. We now want those residences to be really an extension of learning spaces for students. Now, what our approach has been, Thembekile, we have determined that because right now a substantial portion of my students stay off campus, I can tell you the transport costs are enormous, and we have to bear those transport costs because you want the students to be on campus to attend lectures. So what we've done is, and we are moving towards getting as much of the accommodation on campus because we can afford it. We have the land and we can do it. Right now, we have a project that's going to give us about 2,800 beds. And you can imagine that's quite a significant number of students bringing on campus. One, they have easy access to their clinical teaching platforms. They have access to the library and all sorts of things. But also, as you correctly say, in terms of their safety, you are able to do much better when, they are close to you. Now, in the instance that an organization does not have enough land, because you'll have some institutions that do not have land, one of the approaches probably would be to get into engagements with the private developers, but who are closer by the university. Because remember, Thembekile, when you talk about a university, it's also about the relevance of that university to the community in which it is located. And so it is possible to get into engagements with developers who are closer to the university and get into a triple P arrangement with them in which accommodation is built but much closer to the university. I mean, I was in a university previously where we had such an arrangement, and students would actually walk. And what we did in the evenings is the university then provided almost a safe corridor so that we then had patrol vehicles between the campus and the private accommodation that was not too far from the university. So there are various ways and various models if accommodation is not available. I mean, if the land to build is not available.
And you make such a good point, Prof, about universities responding to the needs of their communities, because each university exists in one of the multiple contexts of South Africa. For example, the needs of Sefako Makgato are not exactly the same to the needs of someone at Stellenbosch University, even if there are similarities, right?
Yes. Absolutely. No, absolutely, Thembekile. We live in our unique environments, and certainly each of those is very unique. I mean, I'm just thinking when you talk about that, community engagement is one of our core businesses as a university. Beyond teaching and learning and research, it's about community engagement, and also then the relevance that you have with the community is going to be different. The way I attend to my community within Harankua is going to be very different, for example, from a community, as you have mentioned, of Stellenbosch. So yes, there are certainly those unique differences within which universities are located. The UJ, sorry, Thembekile, I just wanted to go to what the UJ president has indicated, which is a reality. Because of the minimum norms and standards that the department has provided, student beds are now expensive because you are forced to have those minimum norms and standards. And for me to be able, when those are constructed, to be able to make a business sense out of it, you're going to pay a premium for it. Now, if there are really developers who are able to provide good quality residence at a lower price, that would allow students who are unable to afford the premium that you pay for this other accommodation to have a place that is decent. But I think we institutions, and that's my advice to the UJ president, is that when that happens, it is very important that the university and that service provider have a full appreciation of what is being provided. Because what then happens, Thembekile, is should something happen in such a facility, ultimately we are still accountable as vice chancellors and university. So it is a good approach, but we would still want as a university to be absolutely sure that that facility is secure, is the right place for our students, but that it is at a low cost.
Yeah. And Prof, I'm thinking now of your area. I mean, you're in the Garangua area, township setting, so there would be, for example, rooms to let, etc. When I was in the Auckland Park area, also went to UJ, full disclosure, there were a lot of people who weren't in the accredited places, NSFAS accredited, so to speak, and they lived around the West Dean area, and the rest of it. And I wonder how then we get around that when much of the affordable accommodation is unaccredited. Issues of safety, because ultimately people, as you were saying, would expect you as the institution to account should harm occur. How do we do that? How do we formalize them? How do we bring them up to scratch, basically?
So for example, what I've done at SMU is that we have an agreement. It's almost like a memorandum of agreement with the community entrepreneurs, if you want to, the business forum within the area that we are. And so should such a facility be built within Harankua, what we would want to do is within the ambit of a memorandum of agreement or memorandum of understanding is have that conversation and allow our professionals to go and have a look at what that facility is and also advise those developers what it is that we would expect from them. So on matters like this, Thembekile, it's really about communication, engaging, and then advising. It is good to have this alternative lower cost accommodation, absolutely, because that provides an opportunity for students who otherwise wouldn't have accommodation. But we also have a responsibility to make sure that it is, if you want to say, fit for purpose for the students. So I think that engagement and communication would be absolutely imperative. And I'm sure any other university, not just mine, would be very happy to send our professionals there to have a look at audits and to give advice.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Prof. Let me bring in Mary Mabonya once more from Fundi. Mary, let me get you to weigh in on the issue of student accommodation. Are you getting more and more people coming to you, especially to speak about that?
Yes, Thembekile, we are getting students who come to us to apply for the student accommodation. So in the effort to support the universities, here at Fundi, we have an accommodation platform which was introduced to manage and allow the sponsors or the students to have access to accredited properties within the close proximity to their desired institution. So here we can manage accreditation and safe accommodation for the students.
Speak to me about accreditation. What does it entail from your side? What would you require?
So some of the universities, they prefer to do their own accreditation. And here at Fundi, their property should be registered, should be safe, should be next to the institution. For example, we'll find that there is a student coming from Limpopo going to study in KZN. That poor student doesn't know anything about KZN, doesn't have a clue as to where are they going to stay. So our accommodation platform will solution for their challenges by enabling them to go to the platform and search for the desired accommodation, which sometimes is accredited by the university.
Are you able to do your own accreditation? What sort of checks and
Yes,
balances would you need if the
yes,
institution has not graded the place?
we have a department that is specializing by doing those accreditation. We have various bodies that the property should be registered with. If such accreditation are approved, then we can enter into agreement with that particular property, and the student can be allowed to stay there.
All right, I would like us to shift gears and talk about funding, but talk about the issue of timelines, right? So there's a big rush at the beginning of the year where people say, well, I've just applied, I'm still waiting for a response, or I applied in November, December, and I'm still waiting for a response. And one of the questions here that I had seen from Jermaine, Mary, to you, was saying that are there ways in which funding institutions can cut down on waiting times? How quickly do you respond, and can it be a shorter time so that things move with speed?
So during peak period, which is middle of January to end of March, our turnaround time mostly it's at least 24 to 48 hours. If the documents, if the applicant provides us with all relevant documents, the turnaround time can be much quicker.
And Professor Mbati, let me come back to you. The issue of time, there's always that collision, isn't it, at the beginning of the year where you've also not just a problem with people who said they are seeking funding, but those who say, I'm still waiting for approval or for the actual deposit to be made. Where does that leave you as an institution? What can you do?
So, Thembekile, I must say we're very generous. We're very understanding about challenges that students face around funding. And so if we get confirmation that a student will get funding from whether it is a NSFAS, whether it is from Fundi or any other financial institution, and that the funding hasn't been deposited, all we need is confirmation that you will get funding. We will accept you in the university, and we will then follow up in due time to say, this funding is outstanding. But we do not deny students admission on the basis that the money has not been deposited into the university accounts.
And or is the private sector meeting you halfway? Are they able then to resolve things speedily? Because like any other institution, universities need money to run. So do they honor their commitments? Because I remember a time when I was in varsity again, where we'd be halfway through the year and someone would still be saying, well, I'm anxious because company X is yet to deliver on their commitment to pay.
Yes. Typically, the majority do their payments on time, as agreed, the majority, and then there are a few that you have to follow up. But we are very diligent. We will continuously remind them because the pressure also comes from the students who would not have received the funding. The majority really play ball. Yes.
So what happens to the student during that time, Prof, where in the minority of cases, there has been, let's say, 6 months or we're almost 10 months into the year, and all you still have is that letter of commitment, yet there's no payment? Does it fall on the student to then make sure that the monies are paid?
In our case, Thembekile, let me put it this way. We've never deregistered a student on the basis that you have a commitment letter and the funds have not been made available. We've never done that. We have a committee that the student would present their case. And by the way, we also call. So we have within our financial aid office, somebody will call Thembekile and say, Thembekile, you are the CEO of this company. Please, there is some funds that are still outstanding for this particular student. So we support the students in that. All we need really is a commitment letter. And I can tell you, Thembekile, sometimes that is rolled into the other year. So the student will still have a debt, but we also know that there is a commitment to do the payment. Ultimately, the payment does come through. Once there is a letter of commitment, it takes long, but we would never, at least not at SMU, we would not deregister a student on the basis that the payment has not been effected.
Mm-hmm. Kolisi, as an SRC leader, what is your view on how long it takes sometimes for the issues around funding to be sorted, whether a person is approved or not, and when the money eventually is deposited so that the stress is taken off the shoulders of the student?
Thanks. Look, I think from a perspective of student leaders, of course, the sooner the better. I'll start by mentioning that. However, let me go to the earlier comment that was made by, I think it's the VC. Look, or rather from Fundi, the lending division. Look, we want that Fundi should be able to capacitate the lending division, or let me say, in a perspective of lending institutions, they must be able to capacitate their lending division such that it speaks directly to students whom are doing maybe they're doing an internship program somewhere, and they want to pursue or further their studies. I mean, a student would say, I have a degree in this field, and I want to pursue my honors in this, and I currently have what you call I currently have an internship which I'm serving. So lending divisions or lending institutions must be able to be capacitated to say that we are checking the credit score, and based on what the student is saying that they have on a monthly basis, we're able to give them funding speedily and timeously, such that they don't fall out from the registration deadlines, because that also becomes an issue. You find that your letter from whatever bursary funding or from whichever lending institution comes at a time when the university has closed its registration, then we have a problem. But the call is clear to say that these lending divisions must also be able to give, if you are provisionally approved, they must be able to indicate that, because we see it happen with government. NSFAS is able to indicate to you, Thembekile, to say you have been provisionally funded, and once you are provisionally funded, that gives the directive to universities to say you can go ahead and register the student. NSFAS will make the funds available to that student. So we also want the same narrative to cut across private institutions and other lending institutions, so that students are able to register timely. Also, when it comes to, I think the VC mentioned that there's a problem where students during the course of the year might face deregistration from the university. That's a problem. But the commitment that SRCs call for is that once a student is registered for the academic year, it means that the university has assessed them upon registration to say there is funding and the student can register for the academic year. If for whatever reason the funds are not available during the course of the year, we then say that the universities must be able to allow the student to finish their academic year and then make alternative arrangements to make sure that they pay this. Currently, we have an issue of students who are being defunded by NSFAS, but we are not experiencing a challenge where the universities are saying we are deregistering you. So at least there is a balance from government, and we want to see the same happen for all students who rely on private sector funding or rely on institutions that lend them money for their fees.
And Golis, I'm hoping you can help us answer this question here from Presh. I'm just going back to the comment section. Presh said this: I'm trying to register while homeless in a quest to get an education. He said, well, Presh, they say, I'm not sure if it's a guy or a girl or a young woman, sorry, says, in essence, I've been failed by the SRC, the institution, and student housing departments. I'm not sure which institution that is. Would the SRC be able to help someone in that situation? Let's say if they were coming to you, Jay.
Look, if they were to come to UJ, of course, we have a plan to assist these students, because not only are beds available at the University of Johannesburg at the beginning of the year, even mid-semester or mid-year rather, beds are made available, because some of our students have programs that only end during the course of the year. Maybe the student is residing on campus, but they're only registered for modules or for a course that ends at the middle of the year. So what then happens is that beds are made available to those students, and those students can, and then we are able to offer beds to those students who are saying that it's mid-year, I've been defunded by this particular particular funding institution, and I need beds. We do have students that we are currently assisting who are having similar challenges by these beds that are made available by the university from time to time.
Mary Maponya from Fundi, I want to come back to you. There's a question about how you're able to assist people who perhaps are taking a short course that lasts perhaps 6 months, a year. Do you look at that the same way as you would someone who is doing a degree, for example?
Yes, Mtolisi, the qualifying criteria is the same. Yes, we do assist those students who intend studying short courses, executive courses. Yes, absolutely, we do assist them.
And can someone come to you? There was a question earlier, I can't remember now who asked the question, but they wanted to know, for instance, let's say if I am married to someone or am a sibling, whatever the context, would I still be able then to get funding from you on their behalf?
Absolutely. They can provide us with an affidavit stating their relationship, and we can assist them.
Just keep those questions coming for those of you in the audience, because we want to ask as many of them as possible, and then we can be able to put them to the VC, to Mkolisi from the SRC, and Mary Maponya from Fundi, so that we get the very best response for you today, especially, as I was saying earlier, because many people are now looking at their financing options going into 2024, whatever the context, whether you're going into first year or are continuing with study, but need a change in the way in which you are funded. There's another question I saw earlier. Ngobile wants to know which other organizations can assist with settling student fees or debt, especially for those who are unemployed and do not have any surety. Mary?
For a student or for an applicant to qualify, they have to be permanently employed. We don't need surety, but they have to be permanently employed.
All right. And sorry, ma'am, do you want to continue? Excuse me.
No, thank you.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you, Thembekile.
Late registration. Another question here from Annelisa Mpetega for you, Memaponya. Wants to know if there is an issue around late registration. Would you cover such cases? And what about people who need supplementary exams, etc.? Do you look into that at all?
Only if the institutions allows them. So for us to pay, the institution must register them. So if they are late, they want to register that falling into a late registration criteria or category, the institutions should allow them to register, because we don't want to pay the institution and you'll find that unfortunately they cannot be able to register.
Let me then go back to Professor Mbati on the issue of late registration. Prof, how much of a complication does that add to the mix for you?
So I can tell you many universities don't appreciate late registration because it introduces a lot of difficulties in the system. Unless there's a very good reason, a student falls sick, but otherwise we rarely, especially at SMU, entertain late registration. The programs are so, they're very rigorous. And if a student isn't there within 2-3 weeks and finds the classmates are well ahead, they find it very difficult to really catch up. So many institutions really do not encourage late registration. We encourage, and I think our keynote address in the beginning spoke about planning and so on. You need to plan well in advance. In very rare instances do we have late registrations, very rare instances, and this is really on a case-by-case basis, really also for the interest of the student. Sometimes we then insist that rather come the following year and start on your program. I know for a student that really looks like a big punishment, but we have also witnessed where there's late registrations, it does affect the performance of the student, for the better part of the year.
And Mkolisi, as SRC, maybe you can come in here when Prof tells us that universities don't look kindly upon late registrations. Many people would be waiting on campus, even when lectures have started, still waiting, hoping that something will come through. And the reality in this country, am I right, is that if you're unable to make it within the late registration window, and let's say you have to go back home if you'd come to Johannesburg, for instance, that means you're likely to face an even bigger hurdle making it back for 2024. And many of those young people would be lost to the system forever, right?
Yes, of course. Look, the challenges are very different. And I would just want to quote one example just to make the audience understand one thing. So registration closes maybe first week of February as an example. But then SRCs from time to time with no VC would then write emails requesting for extensions. That is because we have understood that the South African uh, 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 society or community rather does not have a sustainable um, funding tool that is provided by NSFAS, because you find that many of our students are not approved by NSFAS at year end, but they get approved by NSFAS at the beginning of the year. Some of them are able to obtain funding while they are still trying to sort out their registration. So there are many reasons why registrations are called to be extended. But our call that we would normally make in the University of Johannesburg is to say capacitate the university such that the division or the department that deals with registration processes is able to take in the pressure that comes with the registration challenges and the registration extensions that are there at the beginning of the year. So we have managed to find a way to these challenges at the University of Johannesburg. And some of our students are even able to, of course, with exceptional cases, are even able to register mid-year. So this has been an ongoing effort by our university. And the call would be that, of course, this should be the case across board and not just in some universities.
Do you think, Ngolisi, that ultimately the problem we have is that tertiary education in this country is simply too expensive?
Of course, it is very expensive. For example, you find a student, you find a learner that has been studying in Zingizing, in Limpopo, or in Mgungundlovu of KZN, uh, and they have not been paying anything since grade one. They are residing at an RDP, so they've not been paying anything since grade one. And you come to university and you are sitting with a tertiary bill of 100,000 in your first year of study, and that's a challenge. So tertiary education is extremely expensive in our country, and as such, we our call is clear. You would know that we are still resolute on the government providing fee-free education to all students in the higher education sector.
Professor Mbati, you are in the Kalankua area with the Sefako Makgato University, and I would imagine you would see firsthand coming in and out of campus the many young people who live around a university, but because of where they were born and the sort of families they were born into, it remains a dream that for many is still too far a distance to reach.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And you know, education is supposed to be the equalizer. We know that. And it is totally unacceptable that because a student comes from a financially constrained background, that becomes a reason why they cannot get a university degree. It's totally unacceptable. It's immoral. And I think the Constitution, the South African Constitution, the Higher Education Act makes it very clear that access to universities and tertiary institutions should be something that is a right to everybody. Now, correctly as you put it, Thembekile, then tuition or the fees that students pay becomes a barrier. And that is why you have government institutions such as the NSFAS to ensure that such students are not left behind. Of course, again, Thembekile, it is about your performance. It's a very competitive sector. Now, if you perform very well, Thembekile, you come from a really, really disadvantaged background. By the way, in terms of the mean scores that NSFAS and various funders put there, you go right to the top. So I think in South Africa, we've created, it may not be sufficient, but I think largely there has been that response to make sure that an academically performing student cannot be denied the opportunity to get access into higher education. Because if you do that, you are then perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Now, in my institution and others where I have been, Thembekile, we've seen students that come from really difficult backgrounds, and with the support that they get from NSFAS and other funders, have thrived, and some of them become great leaders in the country. We must do more because, like I said, the numbers are growing. The pot of money that we put should really grow so that nobody is left behind. But largely, Thembekile, I think the government has done fairly well. Private sector has come on board. The challenge is that the demand is still high.
But Prof, the other ongoing education conversation, especially in your space and among students, I picked this up earlier this year when there were demonstrations around Wits University where they were saying, it's one thing to speak of quote unquote academically deserving candidates who would be the A perhaps students or those just beneath them. But what some of the students were saying at the time was that the challenge is that not everyone is an 80-90% student, right?
Yeah.
So what if you are a 55, 60%, 65% student who really works hard and would like to study, but unfortunately your capacity doesn't go all the way to 80? What do we do with that category of student who, yes, their full potential is 65 and they want to do better, but the criteria is such that the A students will get in first or will take up all the positions?
Yes. No, Thembekile, again, it's a very fair question. Whether the student is from quintile 1 or quintile 5, in terms of the learning experiences that they're given is different. And if I'm in a more advantaged institution, it's much easier for me to get an 80%, really high grade. But you might find that a student from quintile 2 who gets a 60% probably is a much harder worker. So those things are there. The challenge is, Thembekile, you have to have a system that is seen to be fair, that is seen to be transparent. And so you have to rank all your applicants. Now, in organizations like mine, but also I know many universities do that, we have what we call an ECP stream, where you get students that come from, quintile 1, quintile 2 that don't do particularly well, but have performed to a particular level. And so you allow them into the university. And by the way, some of them turn up doing even better than what we call the A graders, because they're originally really hard workers. It's just that they came from a background where they didn't have that opportunity. So I'm in agreement with you. The other issue is you have limited spaces. Again, if I use the example of the Sefako Mahato Health Sciences University, we can only bring in about 320 students to do MBCHB every year. We get thousands of applications. And by the way, you also get really well-performing students that just can't get into the system because the competition is really high. And therefore, the need, again, to expand the enrollments becomes necessary. We are doing that for a number of our programs to ensure that, you don't constrict those numbers. They must be reasonable so that you also don't leave out deserving students. So, yeah, it is a number of things at Thembekile that we have to look at. One is increasing the enrollment so that you have more students coming in. But like I said, many of our universities have the ECP program, where, a program that would take 3 years now takes 4 years because your foundation programs to provide the necessary support for those students. We never leave them out, Thembekile. By the way, even in medicine, you have an ECP program. You have, a number of students that go in with a normal ranking, but you also take students from the lower quintile groups, and then they have 1 extra year to do their medical program.
All right, thank you very much for that, Professor Mbati. Let's go back to the questions that we're getting on the comments portal. And I've got another one here, in fact, for you, Memabonya. It's about Fundi and when people who have been successful and granted funding can then start to pay back their loans. let's say if I today's what, the 27th, do I then start paying back on the 30th or the next month, etc.?
After the approval, you start paying back the next month. If we approve you today on the 27th, you start paying back in August.
And is there a cap on how much people can get from you?
It depends on the affordability, and also we'll look at the invoice or the quotation from the university.
Right. We're almost nearing, well, we are in fact nearing the end of our session this morning. So if you still have some questions that you would like answered, please send them through so that we can put them to the panel before we wrap. We've got about 5 more minutes left on this. And as we do that, let me then run around the room, if you will, even if it is virtually, and go back to you, Mxolisi, as we near the end and get your impressions of where we are and the way forward.
Look, I think we are at a time where the collaboration between government and private sector needs to be to be clear and visible for all to see, especially as it relates to higher education funding. Because I learned of a model, a funding model by private sector where they wish to get a PEE scores by funding students in tertiary, or by clearing the debt of students in the higher education sector. This, of course, is an initiative that is driven by private sector, and I think we will see it being rolled out in a considerable time, where private sector will clear the debt of a particular university in an effort to gain PEE scores, because some of these companies don't have the required PEE scores to participate in whatever economy that exists in South Africa. So this initiative would look towards helping that. So it is a sustainable way of funding. So I think if we were to see that happen in the country, then it will give rise, or it will show the indications that we can sustain funding in South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Mxolisi. Let me come to you, Professor Mbati, and get your view as we end. Again, the same question: where we are, where we could go, and how do we get there?
So I think, to be fair, there's been a lot of progress. If you look back the last, many years, there has been progress. Much more could be done. We need to develop alternative funding models. We can't just fully rely on government. Government, I think, has just too much on their hands. I like what the UJ president has indicated. By the way, when we train these graduates, for whom are we training these graduates? Many of them end up in the private sector. So private sector has a moral obligation to contribute towards this skill that finally lands. By the way, government pumps in all this money, and finally the skill goes to serve private sector. So private sector has a moral obligation to really get involved. But again, for those who have graduated and who have been supported by whatever means, we need to find a way in which they plow back. So President UJ, when you graduate and start working and getting a good salary, we must find a way in which you contribute to a kitty that supports other young graduates that also need to be funded through higher education. Education is an expensive exercise. Quality education is an expensive exercise, and somebody has to pay for it. And so we have to find those innovative ways. And Thembekile, making sure that we do not deny access to anybody who qualifies to get into higher education. It's a complex ecosystem. I think there is, in my view, there is a will from all sectors. It's a question of sitting down and revisiting these issues. I mean, as vice chancellors, we've had opportunities many times before to come up with various models. I think in a conversation, a similar conversation that we had, in a seminar, indicated that we need to revisit some of those models because we kind of packed them and revisit them and probably refine them. It's going to continue getting expensive, but we must make sure that we do not deny access to deserving young South Africans that need to get into higher education. Yeah, so thank you very much, Thembekile. I could go a little more, but I think that kind of summarizes where we are.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Mbati. I'm going to allow you then, Mary Maponya, to have the final word today. We're talking about the challenges as they stand around the student loan landscape, where we are and where we could go and how. Your thoughts?
Thembekile, as a country, we have come a long way with regards to financing education over the coming years. Here at Fundi, we are aiming to introduce a more affordable model to enable us to reach more missing middle household. As we indicated before, our aim is to continuously work closely with the universities and the private colleges. We have noticed that education is expensive, and Fundi, we are here to support the nation.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Mary Maponya, Executive Head of Lending at Fundi. We also had on our panel this afternoon now, the Professor, Vice Chancellor at Sefako Makgatho Health Sciences University, Professor Peter Mbati. Thank you to you as well. And from the University of Johannesburg, the SRC President Mxolisi Manana, also rounding up our panel this morning. My thanks to you all for your participation and helping us traverse, if you will, through the various issues within the higher education space, especially when we look at student loan landscape problems. And thank you to all of you who have posed questions as well as listened in as we've been speaking in the last, hour and a half or so. For myself, Thembekile Mrototo, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope that the next time we all reconnect, it'll be under better circumstances. For now, thank you all for joining and have a wonderful afternoon further. Bye-bye.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Mail and Guardian, if you really want to know."